Dr. Aslan, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You are the author of No God But God. The second God in that title is capitalized, and that's very important for our conversation.
That's right.
And on September 2nd, for our audience, on September 2nd of this year, 2025, the a special 20th anniversary of this book will be published by Random House. So be sure to go and fetch that book. In this conversation, I want to speak with you in historical terms. We're not really going to get into faith that much.
Mhm.
In historical terms, about the origins of God in Islam. So, and God with a capital G, Dr. Aslan. So let's set the stage for our audience, please. What was the Arabian Peninsula like before Islam?
You know, when you talk to Muslim theologians or when you look at the traditions that arose out of the first few generations of Islam, oftentimes they refer to pre-Islamic Arabia as the time of Jahiliyyah or the time of ignorance. And they like to paint it as an era of darkness, of confusion, an era of paganism, which is a complicated word, doesn't
Yeah.
exactly mean, I think, what most people think it means, an era of rampant polytheism. And then, like a flash of light in darkness, the Prophet Muhammad receives this revelation and introduces this brand new concept to the pagan Arabs, the
Brand
idea,
new concept.
brand new, untouched, unheard of concept
Okay.
uh, called monotheism, the idea of a singular God. And that God even has a designation, Allah. Um, well, I don't need to tell you that that traditional view of pre-Islamic Arabia is absolutely fictional. It's a complete fantasy. Almost nothing of what I just described is accurate. First and foremost, pre-Islamic Arabia was an era and a region that exhibited profound sophistication when it came to religion and religious thought. It was incredibly
Profound
diverse,
sophistication?
profound sophistication. Almost every conception of the divine that we are familiar with existed in pre-Islamic Arabia. Certainly polytheism, the conception of multiple gods, pantheism, the idea that all things, all creation is God and God is all things. Um, Henotheism, the notion that yes, there are lots of gods, but only one of these gods is the main god. More
Is that like
sophisticated
first among
versions.
equals? Is that what you mean by
Yes.
that?
Well, henotheism doesn't necessarily mean first among equals because the high god is the most powerful god. But the
I see.
concept of henotheism represents that high god as inaccessible. Usually, that high God is the creator
I
God, the
see.
sustainer God. But that's not the God that you go to when your goat is sick. That's not the God that you go to, when you're about to have a baby or you need rain. That God doesn't care
It's
about
not your
rain for
everyday
sick goats.
utilitarian
Right.
God. Yeah, I see.
And then on top of that, there is this kind of more sophisticated version of henotheism that views that high God as really the sole divinity, and that all the other gods are actually reflections of the different attributes of that God, but they're not independent gods. And then, if that weren't enough,
Yeah,
this
yeah.
is a region that was teeming with at least a dozen or so Jewish tribes, many of whom practiced a distinctly Arabian version of Judaism, one that was in some ways disconnected from the Judaism that one finds, for instance, in the Levant or in Israel, Palestine at the time. And then Again, if that weren't enough,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
there were a large number, some very powerful, some very wealthy, number of Christian tribes. And these Christians themselves were diverse. There were groups of Christians that we refer to as monophysite Christians.
Yeah.
These are Christians who reject the doctrine of the Trinity, and who believe that Jesus really only had one nature, and they usually split into two. There are the so-called, um, like the Coptic Christians, for instance, believe that
Yeah.
Jesus is fully divine, has no human nature, whereas the Nestorian Christians believe that Jesus was fully human, had no divine nature. And then there were also the Gnostics. In other words, all of these various Christian heterodox groups that had to flee Christian lands because they were being persecuted
Hmm.
by the time the fourth century rolls around, and there is this thing now called Christian orthodoxy that is being violently pressed upon the Christian communities. All these heterodox communities got the heck out and went down into the Arabian Peninsula. So by the time that the Prophet Muhammad is born, this is a region that is teeming with gods and religions and different versions of spirituality. It's the exact opposite
Of being
of
brand
the
new.
Jahiliyyah, the time of ignorance.
And it's not, we're going to get into the brand new concept in a moment, but I was, furiously taking notes, just trying to keep up with you with all these different concepts of religion and religiosity. So this is not brand new, having a god of some sort.
No, by the way, I didn't even mention the Buddhists. There were Buddhists
In
in the
Arabia?
Arabian Peninsula as well. Yeah, that's right. So again, you name it, like it was there. The idea that the Prophet Muhammad arose at a time of profound religious ignorance and then brought a brand new concept to the Arab peoples is just false in every way. In every way, that is false.
Um, was there a different exercise of religion in the cities versus, let's say, out in the desert?
Yes, but I'm gonna put it in a different way. There was a
Okay,
different exercise of religion amongst the nomadic tribes as opposed to the sedentary tribes.
I see. Yeah,
When we're
yeah.
talking about the Arabian Peninsula, the term city is very difficult to apply pretty much to any where, with the possible exception of Mecca. And primarily that's because Mecca had become a kind of regional trading hub. And it
Mhm.
became a regional trading hub, a kind of an economic center of the Arabian Peninsula for a very simple reason, because it housed the Kaaba. And we'll talk about the Kaaba in a
Yeah,
moment,
yeah,
what
yeah,
that
yeah.
is. But this central shrine, which everyone, regardless of who your god was, had to visit in order to kind of perform the rites and the ceremonies and make the necessary
Regardless
sacrifices,
of who your god was, is that what you said?
regardless of who your god was. Yeah.
That's
Um,
such an interesting thing to say.
let's talk about the pre-Islamic Kaaba for just a moment before we get
Yeah.
to this sedentary nomadic, because it's it's of the same story. So the truth of the matter is we have no idea where the Kaaba came from or really how long it's been there. It
Isn't the religious
obviously,
story that it came from Abraham and doesn't
right,
it?
yeah.
Yeah, that's the
So
religious story.
right, the Quran says that it has its roots in Abraham. The Quran actually goes so far as to say that, this is where Adam arose, and then this is where Abraham almost sacrificed I'm sorry, Ishmael. In
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
Jewish story, it's Isaac. In the
Exactly.
Muslim story, it's the other brother, Ishmael.
Yeah.
Um, the Quran says this is where, when Hagar, Ishmael's mother, was forced out of Abraham's home by Sarah after Isaac was born, that Hagar and Ishmael came to this spot. And there's a well next to the Kaaba called Zamzam, still exists, a natural spring, if you will. And there, the natural spring miraculously nurtured them, and that this was eventually what led to the building of this shrine. Um, but that's the religious
That's the
explanation for
religious.
it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The historical explanation is we're not sure. We do know from the data that we have that it was there long before the Prophet Muhammad, maybe centuries before the Prophet Muhammad. The sort of prevailing theory is that it's not the Kaaba that made that area in Mecca, what would become known as Mecca, sacred, but Zamzam, the well, that the well was there first, which of course makes sense. I
It's a
mean, if
desert
you're in a
area.
desert area,
Yeah,
right,
yeah,
and
yeah.
there's a natural flowing spring, that's going to be seen as a sacred site. And there is reason to believe that the original Kaaba, that is a sort of, cube square-like structure,
Mhm.
was originally built for no other reason than to house the tools and the instruments that were part of the sacred rituals that revolved around Zamzam, revolved around the well. But what is clear is that eventually, after some time, that structure was roofed, and it became a holding place not for these instruments, but for idols. And it seems fairly clear that Hubal, the Syrian moon god, was very likely the original main deity for the Kaaba. That was the sort of the major god in the Kaaba. But eventually, whether on purpose or just by accident, other gods, symbolized by various forms of idol, whether wood or stone or what have you, began to be housed in the Kaaba. But it really wasn't until this one particular tribe
Mhm.
called the Quraysh, the sort of major
Oh,
tribe of the Hijaz, this area in Western Arabia that we're discussing, that includes Mecca, that they had a fairly ingenious idea, which is that already they were sort of in charge of Zamzam and the Kaaba in its infancy, in its infant form. Already they were witnessing tribes from all over the region making this pilgrimage to the Kaaba in order to visit with their particular deity, make sacrifices, and you're there already, might as well conduct a little bit of business. And so the Quraysh had this ingenious idea, which was, let's go around the Arabian Peninsula, because there are temples everywhere. There are idols everywhere. Each tribe has its own tribal deity. And let's go get those idols and let's bring them to the Kaaba. Now, everyone, everyone, if they want to visit their God, has to come to us. And oh, here's an even better idea. We'll uh, exact a small toll for entering the city. You want to visit your God? Well, it costs you a little bit of money to come and visit your God. And we'll make sure that by the rules of Semitic sanctuaries, no violence can ever be um, had in the region of the Kaaba. So this becomes kind of a sacred city in that way.
this is a
And then
business.
it's all a business. It's 100% a business. This is a commercial enterprise. And of
Huh.
course, now if it's a safe place, well, of course, you're going to bring your goods with you to
Yeah, yeah,
visit your
yeah.
God, and then you'll trade your goods, and the Quraysh will accept a little bit of a tax on all the goods that are traded. A genius idea that in a very short time leads to the Quraysh becoming unquestionably the most powerful, the wealthiest tribe in the entire Arabian Peninsula. Their wealth and their power is utterly dependent upon their control of this universal sanctuary, which, according to tradition, has 360 gods in it. Now, that's not a real number, that's a sacred number. It really reflects the fact that a lot of the rituals that took place at the Kaaba, including the circumambulations, which still are a part of the Hajj pilgrimage, circling around the Kaaba
Yeah.
a set number of times, was meant to have astral significance in some way, that there was an attempt to connect what was happening on the ground with what's happening in the heavens, hence the notion that there are 360 gods. The point is that there were a lot of gods, all the gods.
Wow.
And in fact, not just the gods of the Arabs or the so-called pagans, but Abraham was inside the Kaaba. So the Jews would come and visit the Kaaba. Jesus was along with his mother Mary, was inside the Kaaba.
What do you mean
So
Jesus was inside the Kaaba? I mean, that
there
was,
was a painting of Jesus and his mother. And remember, this is an important point as I continue with this, because I keep saying the word idol, idol, idol a lot. And I think
yeah,
we
yeah,
in the modern world have a kind of negative connotation to what idol means. And,
yeah,
and in
yeah,
fact, we even talk about it like, oh, they worshiped slabs of stone. What ignorant people. No, no, they did not worship slabs of stone. They were far more sophisticated, in fact, when it comes to religion than we are. They
huh.
understood that these slabs of stone were not themselves the gods, but they were endowed with the spirit of the god. And so, if you wanted to have a communion with that god, let's say Hubal, who's the moon god, you don't pray to the moon. You pray to the idol, which has a portion of the spirit of that God within it. And so the painting of Jesus had a portion of the spirit of Jesus in it, just as the idol of Abraham, who happened to be figured throwing divining rods, which is a very pagan ritual to do. Divining rods are how, in the ancient world, you would sort of figure out what the gods wanted. Um, so you had
Like
Abraham in there,
literally
you
a
had
rod that
Jesus
you
in
would,
there.
it's like literally a
Yeah.
rod.
Yeah,
Oh, wow.
it sticks. That's exactly right. It's a bunch of sticks. You throw them, and then depending on how they land, you can, make some prophetic judgment about whatever the question is that you're
Yeah.
asking.
Dr. Aslan, may I ask two follow-up questions, please? I'm really intrigued. The Quraysh story, very, very clever. They go around the Arabian Peninsula and they bring in.
Seize.
So I think you just answered it. Is seized? Do you mean militarily they seized it, or was there a trade? Here, we'll give you this much and give us your icon for this god. How did that work? How
We
did?
actually we don't know. We
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
know the mechanism whereby they um got hold of all of these idols. I would imagine sometimes they just took them,
Yeah.
smaller tribes. Sometimes they probably had some kind of deal with them, if it was perhaps a larger tribe or a more powerful tribe, maybe you don't have to pay poll taxes when you come and visit.
Or we have
But
a more
yes,
secure location for you to keep your
that's
god.
right.
That's
But
really interesting.
but unquestionably, as the
Uh-huh.
Quraysh become this massive economic, political, and military superpower in the Arabian Peninsula, at a certain point, they don't ask.
They demand. Is there, you said 360, 360 gods.
That's the tradition. But
That's the
again,
tradition. I got it.
yeah. So
Celestial.
scholars of religion we have this thing that we talk about all the time, which is real numbers and sacred numbers. And whenever you read scripture or a tradition and you get certain numbers, 1, 3, 7, 12, 19, 24, 360, you know immediately that's not a real number. That's not
Oh, wow.
that's just a sacred number. 40 is another one. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights. No, that's not what it means. 40 is a sacred number that means many.
I see.
360 is a sacred number, which means circle, astral, universe, sky. Um, you know, that's how you have to think about it. So
Which
yes,
which
the traditions say there were 360, but that's a fake number. That's a sacred number.
which goes to show that you should not read holy books literally. You literally
Of
need an
course not.
interpreter
No,
to
absolutely.
understand what they're trying to communicate. Uh, do we know what's in the Kaaba now?
Oh yes. Well, that's the end of the story.
Yeah.
What's in the Kaaba now are not idols.
Yeah.
There are a couple of Qurans, a couple of very ancient Qurans, and then there are a handful of sacred objects. I think one presumably goes to the to Noah, another one goes to Solomon. Again, these are just artifacts that have been endowed with sacred meaning. But
Is there a meteor rock in there still?
yes, so as most people know, one of the corners of the Kaaba, by the way, is just a word that means cube, and that's what it is.
Yeah.
It's a cube. It's black. It's meant to signify nothing. That's what's important to understand about the Kaaba. And this is
Oh.
the great bridge between the ancient Kaaba and the Kaaba post the Prophet Muhammad, which we might be getting ahead of ourselves a little
Yeah,
bit
yeah, yeah.
here. But the important thing to understand is that when the Prophet Muhammad ultimately conquers Mecca, the first thing that he does is he clears out all of the idols inside the Kaaba. Very dramatically, he smashes them, breaks them into pieces, cleanses it out. But he keeps the Kaaba. And in fact, not only does he keep the Kaaba, he keeps all of the rituals, the pagan rituals associated with the Kaaba. The things that Muslims do now go back way before the
That's
Prophet Muhammad. They're
fascinating.
taking part in pagan rituals. But Muhammad reinvents them. He reinterprets the meaning behind those rituals. Um, and the Kaaba is empty on purpose because even though it's still referred to as the house of God, there's nothing in there of
Yeah.
significance. God does not dwell in the Kaaba. Really, what the Kaaba represents in its simplicity, in its nothingness, is the unity of the Muslim community, the Ummah. It's meant to be sort of the pole, the cosmic pole around which the whole of the universe rotates. But it itself has no sanctity any longer. In fact, it's been torn down and rebuilt a number of times,
Oh, I
actually.
didn't know
The
that. That's
building,
fast.
the building
Wow.
itself is not sacred. Its
Interesting.
meaning is what's sacred. That's very important
Yeah.
to the foundation of Islam. To your question about, yes, the stone. So, as many people know, on I believe it's the southwest corner of the Kaaba, there is a little sort of indented area, and lodged in that area is what's known as the Black Stone. Also, long predates Islam, and um, we're not positive, but the earliest references to the stone make it very clear that this was a meteorite, that it was a meteorite that fell somewhere in the Arabian Peninsula. And it doesn't take a great deal of imagination to understand why that stone would then be considered sacred.
Yeah. Yeah.
And whether it was the Quraysh or someone before them, it was moved to the Kaaba along with everything, all the other gods. This stone wasn't placed inside the Kaaba, it was attached to the Kaaba. And then these very interesting traditions arose around it, just in the same way that the traditions
Yeah.
arose around who built the Kaaba in the first place, with a very specific goal in mind, and that is to connect it to the Judeo-Christian religious tradition. So the black stone, even though it has nothing to do with it, eventually became associated with the stone upon which the biblical Jacob rests his head when he has that dream of
Oh,
climbing a ladder and battling an angel of the god. So that's Jacob's pillow, is what it's referred to. Now, again,
Muslims attach it to that story.
yes.
Yes.
Again, the goal here, as you're probably starting to note, right, is that here is this mysterious, ancient, quote unquote, pagan structure that post the Prophet Muhammad, for very important and deliberate reasons, becomes explicitly connected to the Judeo-Christian prophetic tradition that literally goes all the way back to Adam, right? Adam was the first to step foot on the land
Yeah.
that we now call, Mecca, where the Kaaba is. That's on purpose.
Hmm. Let's go to a part of this story that really fascinates me before we start. Oh, you were going to ask something. Go ahead, Dr.
Well, we
Islam.
never answered the question of the sedentary versus nomadic. But this is an important point. So,
That's neither my fault nor your fault because there's just so much going on in this period before Islam. So please, let's get
but
back
it
to
does
that.
fit because now look, what happens is not only do the Quraysh become sedentary, they become, you know, this incredibly wealthy, incredibly powerful, um, well, let's go ahead and call it what you call, like a city
Yep.
state
Yep.
structure, right? Mecca suddenly becomes a city. There's no other cities. There are villages and things like that. Um, but at this time, you have two kinds of Arab groups. You have those who have settled down and become sedentary, and those who are still nomadic. And what's really fascinating is that their belief system is the same. The gods that they believe in are the same. A lot of the rituals are the same, but the theology, if you will, between the two is radically different. And of course,
Hmm.
this has to do with their
Hmm.
needs. So, for instance, if you're in a nomadic community where the accumulation of wealth is impossible, you can't accumulate stuff, you're moving from place to place,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What's important to you is not the high gods, the elevated deities, right? They have nothing to offer you. You need rain. You need a water source. You need shelter.
The
You need your
practical stuff.
camel to give birth.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so your spiritual focus and energy is going to be on these so-called intermediaries, the lower gods, the
Wow.
gods that act as kind of messengers, if you will, to the higher gods. That's who you pray to. You don't, the sort of philosophical conversations about the nature of the divine and the order of the pantheon, like these things don't matter to you.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if you're in a sedentary community and you're building temples, right?
Yeah.
You're staying put. Those lower intermediary gods start to lose their significance and their interest. What you are much more interested in is the high gods. What the questions that you ask are
Wow.
not, where do we get our next source of water? The questions you ask is, what is the nature of the universe? What is the nature of human and divine? And those kinds of questions are the kinds of questions that are being asked in every coffee shop, at every caravan in and around Mecca. Again, reminding us one more time that centuries before the Prophet Muhammad was born, this land was a vibrant, diverse, thriving, sophisticated cauldron of religious traditions and, most importantly, religious experimentation. And why do we say that? Because the biggest, most well-established religions in the world at that time, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, and Zoroastrianism, the ancient religion of the Persian Empire, existed in the Arabian Peninsula in heterodox forms because they had all left their center of orthodoxy. They had all abandoned, their homelands and come to this Wild West where there weren't, cardinals threatening to burn you alive if you didn't believe Jesus was fully God and fully man,
Or
right?
Zoroastrian priests.
Or Zoroastrian
Yeah.
priests telling you that you're impure because you touched something and now you've cut yourself off from Ahura Mazda.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Or for that matter, rabbis
Exactly. Yeah.
grounding your entire religiosity on legal conceptions found in, the book of Deuteronomy or Leviticus. No, these were people who were free to experiment and borrow from each other and create new ways of thinking about Judaism or Christianity or Buddhism or Zoroastrianism. So again, an absolute cauldron of sophisticated, diverse religious experimentation. That's the world that the Prophet Muhammad entered in the middle of the 6th century.
Dr. Aslan, do you appreciate that most people don't know this?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Most Muslims don't know this.
Yeah. And then there's a whole issue of censorship and other things but that's a whole different podcast that comes from Islamic governments. So in this Wild West, I'm borrowing your terms, in this cauldron, where does Allah come in?
That's a great question. So the ancient Arabs were already familiar with a god called Allah. And again, let's just remember just real quickly that Allah is not the name of God. Allah is just the contraction of the Arabic word al-ilah, meaning the God. That's what Allah means. It's al-ilah, just means the God. It's very likely that the ancient Arabs conceived of Allah as the Arabian equivalent of this incredibly important Indo-European deity that we refer to as Deus. Deus. That's where we get the word, Dios. That's where we get all deity. It's where it comes from. Deus was, and by the way, it's where we get the word Zeus from. The Greek counterpart, Zeus, is just the Indo-European high god, Deus. Deus, Zeus, Allah, these were all thought of as the sky god. So we're talking about a very early god, very, very early god. And then eventually, certainly this is the case when it comes to Allah, but it happened, as you know very well, with Zeus as well, is that steadily the sky god rises through the ranks of the Arab pantheon to become, as I had mentioned before, something that is referred to often as the high god. And whenever you see the words high God, that means that what we are dealing with here is not polytheism necessarily. Polytheism means lots of different gods, and they're all pretty much the same. They're all pretty much equal. This is a representation of what we refer to as henotheism, which is belief in lots of gods, but only one of them is the king of the gods, the high God. That high god often is the creator god. And then sometimes in more sophisticated versions of henotheism, that high god ended up creating all the other gods, right? So the other gods exist only insofar as the high god made them. But what is interesting is that we don't know whether these ancient Arabs who thought of Allah, al-ilah, the god, as the high god, thought of him as a personalized deity. It's very likely that they probably thought of al-ilah as a kind of abstract spirit, a kind of divine force that underpinned the universe. The reason we believe this is because there's parallels amongst the Mesopotamians, amongst the Egyptians. That's
Hmm.
how they conceived of their high god as well. And I think the fact that Allah is, again, just a contraction, it just means the God, indicates that that's probably what they thought. They didn't think that this God had a personality, that they thought that this God was just a spirit, the God.
Hmm.
It is important to note that of all the gods in the Arabian Peninsula, 360 of them,
Yeah.
the only one that never ever had his own idol in the Kaaba was Allah. Allah never had an idol in the Kaaba, and that's probably because he was thought of as more animating spirit than physical form.
Wow. So in the Kaaba, there is no iconic representation of Allah.
And there never was. There never was. Pre-Islam, obviously, post-Islam. Uh, the
Hmm.
pre-Islamic Arabs believed in Allah, but they never thought of Allah as a material being necessarily. Now, obviously, this starts to change a little bit through the centuries. Um, and it happens in actually very interestingly kind of three steps, if you will. And I'm
Hmm.
being simplistic here, but essentially three steps. First, there's the belief that Allah is the creator of the heavens and the earth. So Allah becomes creator, not just
Wait, is this
animating spirit.
post-Islam?
No, this is way before Islam.
Okay.
This is we're nowhere near Islam yet.
Okay.
We'll get there. The ancient Arabs believed that Allah created the heavens and the earth. And so if you created the heavens and the earth, if you're a creator, then therefore you probably have will, you probably have intention. So now suddenly this animating spirit starts to achieve a kind of personality, if you will, characteristics, if you will.
Hmm.
Secondly, what happens to Allah is what happens to all gods. I wrote an entire book about this process called God, A Human History, which is that all gods eventually become just divine versions of human beings. That's just, and it's a very sophisticated reason why. It's actually a cognitive impulse that we have. We don't need to get into that just yet. But
Mhm.
once Allah becomes creator, he starts to get a little bit of a personality, and then he becomes kind of a material being. And then he does what all material beings do, certainly what all gods, who are considered as material beings, like, for instance, Zeus, he starts having children, physical children, sons and daughters.
Allah.
Yes. So Allah has three daughters, Alat, who was just the Arab equivalent of Athena, if anyone's interested in that.
Yeah.
He has a second daughter named Manat, who is quite clearly the Mesopotamian goddess Ishtar. And then he has a third daughter named Al-Uzza, who is, again, unquestionably just the Arab equivalent of Aphrodite. And these
Wow.
three daughters, Alat, Manat, and Al-Uzza, they become sort of the central deities in pre-Islamic Arabia. Why? Because, again, as I told you before, Allah is inaccessible. The
Yeah.
sky god cannot be reached. You can't pray to the sky god. You can't pray to the high god. He doesn't care about you. So you have to pray to the lower gods and hope that they act as your intermediaries to the high god. Well, what better intermediaries than Allah's daughters? So Alat, Manat, and Al-Uzza, all three of whom were in the Kaaba, played this central role in ancient Arab spirituality. They are the primary intermediaries to Allah. So that's the second thing that happens. First thing that happens, this primordial animating spirit is considered creator, and as creator, he obviously develops intention, will, and eventually personality. The second thing is once he develops personality, he starts to become like any other god. He becomes very human in his wants and needs and desires, including siring children. And these three children especially, Alat, Manat, and Al-Uzza. And then, at a certain point, this Al-Ilah becomes, as the polytheism starts to evolve, becomes associated with and identical with Yahweh,
The
the
Jewish
God.
God.
Yeah, the God of the Jews and the Christians, the same God.
Yeah.
And in fact, by the time that Muhammad is born, the vast majority of Arabs would have believed that Allah is the God of Abraham. Allah was the God that created Adam. Allah was the God that Jesus spoke about. That these were all just multiple manifestations of this single divine being called Allah. And in fact, but when you look at even some of the pre-Islamic writings about Allah, but certainly by the time you get to the Quran, there is no question that Muhammad thought that Allah was Yahweh. Absolutely. I mean, he didn't think that there was anything different between Yahweh and Allah.
Dr. Aslan, just so that I don't forget to ask this, you mentioned three daughters, but before you said sons and daughters, did Allah have sons? And if so, were they significant? They must not have been because you didn't mention them.
No. He just had the three daughters. I just meant gods have sons and daughters. That's what they do.
And it's interesting, in Saudi Arabia, not Saudi Arabia, I apologize, in Arabia. I went forward 2,000 years almost. In Arabia, or 1,400 years, Allah's children are all women. They're all daughters.
Yes.
That's
very powerful, very powerful daughters.
So I have so many questions to ask right now. I need to really bring it to tip of the spear here. So how does Muhammad choose Allah as the God? I mean, I see all the background here, and then convince everyone that, forget about all the other gods, forget about the local God, forget about the three primary daughters of Allah. How does this happen? I'm not talking about the politics.
No. This is great.
Yeah.
This is going to blow your mind. I mean, if you thought pre-Islamic Arabia was different than what you thought, again, going back to the traditional conception of pre-Islamic Arabia and the rise of Muhammad, is that Muhammad was sometime in 610 AD, has this prophetic experience where the angel Gabriel tells him that he is a prophet, and that Allah, who is the same God as Yahweh, he says, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac and Ishmael, the God of Jesus, has called him to preach and become a prophet, etc. And then, according to sort of the traditional Islamic view, Muhammad then goes out and preaches to the pagan Arabs this radically new concept of monotheism. What he says to the pagan Arabs is, there is only one God. There's just Allah, and there are no other gods, and I am that God's messenger. And this was so scandalous. This was so heretical, unheard of, that the ancient Arabs rejected him and eventually, threw him out of Mecca.
Yeah,
and there the story continues. Okay. Two things. Number one, we have already described how incredibly sophisticated pre-Islamic Mecca was.
Yeah.
But we've also noted how incredibly sophisticated the Quraysh were. Their
Yeah.
entire life, the sort of business of their empire was predicated on religion. There was no version of spirituality that they were not familiar and comfortable with. In fact, I just explained, by the time Muhammad is born, most Arabs believe there is only one God, and that God is Allah. Most Arabs believe that that God Allah is Yahweh, the same God as Abraham, had and that Moses had, etc., etc. They believe that essentially that all the other gods are just multiple manifestations of this one God, Allah, that kind of sophisticated form of henotheism that I was describing to you before. But not just that. One of the most vibrant religious movements in Mecca, alongside the Zoroastrians and the Jews and the Christians and the various forms of, polytheism,
Mhm.
was a movement that exists. We know all about it. It's in the Quran, called the Hanifs. Hanifism is what it was called. Hanifism
Oh,
was
wow.
a pre-Islamic monotheistic religion that believed that Allah was Yahweh and the only God, that there were no other gods except Allah. The reason that they called themselves the Hanifs is that they viewed themselves as the true followers of the religion of Abraham. And they believed that the notion that all these other gods are manifestations of this single divine God, not that they were independent gods. Again, most Arabs didn't believe that. Most Arabs believed that these 360 gods are just really manifestations of the one God, Allah, who is also Yahweh. But the Hanifs were they were preachers, they were politicians, many of them were Quraysh. They preached all around the Kaaba during pilgrimage seasons. Um, we have their names. They were very famous individuals, and they preached exactly what many years later Muhammad would preach. What I'm trying to say is Muhammad walking around saying there is no God but Allah would have not just been not new, it would have been not interesting.
You'd be like,
Like,
duh.
yeah, okay, thank you. That's fine. Like you're not the only one saying that. There's lots of people saying that. There's an entire religious movement here that believes that. And frankly, most of us believe that too. Yes, of course there's just the one God, but he's represented in many, many ways. So that's
So,
not the innovation. That's not why
yeah.
everybody was so angry at Muhammad. That's not where the violence came from. The violence came from something else, and you've already kind of touched on it accidentally earlier,
Uh-huh.
which is the difference between Muhammad and the Hanifs is that the Hanifs, even though they believed there was only one God, nevertheless accepted the the Kaaba and its central role in religious life. They accepted the Quraysh's role as the keepers of the Kaaba, even when they were profoundly critical of the polytheism that they saw, they nevertheless revered the sanctuary and its place in ancient Arabian life. Not Muhammad. Muhammad
Oh.
attacked the sanctuary. He would stand near the Kaaba during pilgrimage season and say, there is no reason for you to be here. There's nothing inside of this cube for you. Your idols don't mean anything at all. There is just Allah, and he doesn't have, you know, uh, intermediaries. You don't need to like ask someone else to send your prayer up to Allah. You could just pray to him yourself.
You don't need
He's
Allah's
accessible.
daughters.
You don't need the daughters. In fact, he was very, very critical of Allat, Aluza, and Manat. Um, you don't need these intermediaries. And if you don't need intermediaries, then what are you doing here? Why did you come here? There's no reason for you to come to the Kaaba. And if there's no reason for you to come to the Kaaba, then there is no reason for the entire religio-economic, foundation of the entire Arabian Peninsula. Well, then what is the point?
He's
Why do the
upending
Quraysh have all
everything.
this power? Their entire power, their
Huh.
entire wealth, their entire position is predicated on this repository for the gods that everyone has to come to in order to pray to that stone slab so that that stone, the spirit in that stone slab, can go to Allah and send you his prayer. But this guy is saying, you don't need an intermediary. You can just ask Allah. He loves you. He cares for you. He knows every hair on your head. Just ask him. And so there's no more need for the Kaaba. And so it's not that he is attacking the religious beliefs of the ancient Arabs. As I said, nothing he said would have been new or, frankly, all that interesting to the ancient Arabs when it came to God. What he was attacking was the very financial structure of the entire Arabian system. Because if you don't need the Kaaba, then you don't need the Quraysh.
Yeah.
And that's what got him in trouble.
Um, in some ways, this is my assessment, Dr. Aslan. In some ways, what he was saying was liberating in that you can just connect with Allah yourself. But in some ways, it was also as it morphs, as it evolves, undemocratic because now you can't just use all these intermediaries, all these tribes. Everyone has to change and just go to Allah instead of having their own intermediary. So you're sort of getting rid of the pluralism that existed.
Yes, I suppose that's one way to think about it. I do think that perhaps even more um, revolutionary was, as I mentioned, for most Arabs, they already associated Allah with Yahweh. So that wasn't new. But what Muhammad did was sort of, he re-envisioned the relationship between Yahweh and Allah. And what he did was essentially recast all of the Jewish and Christian traditions that he was familiar with, and he was very familiar with it. He lived surrounded by Jews and Christians.
Yeah.
By recasting Yahweh as Allah. Again, he wasn't replacing Yahweh as Allah. What he was doing was trying to view them as clearly and as explicitly as possible as the same exact God. And so,
Hmm.
he retells all these stories in very sort of clipped forms in the Quran from the Hebrew scriptures. But instead of referring to that deity as Yahweh, who shows himself to Abraham or who, you know, instructs David, the king, or who, um, sends Jesus to earth. He calls that deity Allah
Hmm.
to say they're the same. In fact,
Yeah.
he starts to even refer to his community as the unlettered people, by which he means the people without a book. He sees the Jews as people of the book, they have their own book. He sees the Christians as people of the book, they have their own book. And so he seems to consider his revelation as the Arab equivalent of those two books. And he retells most of the same stories, but
Hmm.
he replaces that deity with Allah. Again, not trying to say that it wasn't Yahweh, it was actually Allah all along. What he's setting down in stone now, a belief that was already there, which is this God that we've been calling Allah for centuries is actually just Yahweh. It's the same exact God. Why? Because there's only one God.
So, what is the faith-based, I don't know, incentive to convert to Muhammad's message versus Hanifism and all the others? When you come to
You
them,
mean at
is
the
it,
very beginning?
yeah, is it the fact that you can directly connect to God versus going through all these intermediaries?
There's very little reason to believe that any one of those first uh, first groups that joined Muhammad's community, and there were very few of them. I think something like 70 of them end up leaving Mecca for what would become known as Medina.
Yeah.
The ones who get exiled, who get thrown out of Mecca for this belief, that any of them actually followed Muhammad because they were blown away by the theology of
Yeah,
this
I'm
new
waiting for
version.
the wow moment here. Like, what is the wow factor of
The wow
conversion? Yeah.
factor is this, and it goes back to what we were saying earlier about the difference between the sedentary tribes and the nomadic tribes. The tribal system functions only insofar as there is some sense of equality between the tribes. Because you have to understand that in ancient Arabia, this is actually true of a lot of tribal communities, there is no divine lawgiver. There is no sort of 10 commandments that says what is and what is not right to do, etc.
Hmm.
There is only what is good for the tribe. So I use this example sometimes when talking about this. So in pre-Islamic Arabia, murder is not in and of itself bad. It's not in and of itself a sin or even a crime.
Huh. Huh.
What makes it a crime is, in fact, there's this very complicated sort of retribution with like blood money and how much everything is worth. You got to maintain sort of equilibrium. What makes it a crime is if it damages your tribe. So if I'm in tribe A and I murder someone from tribe B, the law of retribution says that tribe B is owed a life from tribe A. My job as the head of tribe B is to extract that life, to exact that life. And it could be a life, it could be an arm. Let's say tribe A stole one of tribe B's camels. My job is to get that another camel. It's the quintessential eye for an eye, lex talionis, right?
Okay.
That is the law of tribal communities. But that only works if the tribes are more or less equal. When you start to have one tribe, the
The
Quraysh,
Quraysh. Yeah.
become so big, so powerful, so untouchable, so wealthy, then the tribal balance is off. There is no more, lex talionis. There is no more law of retribution. You know,
Hmm.
I mean, what do you if a member of the Quraysh kills a member of the Hashim, you think the member of the Hashim can do anything about it? No,
Oh no. Yeah.
the head of the tribe of Hashim is going to demand, a retribution. Too bad. Deal with it. Worse, a tribe itself is considered strong only insofar as it can care for its weakest members. That's why the unprotected become the ward of the tribe, so the orphan or the widow or what have you. But when you have the Quraysh and you have this sudden, massive accumulation of property and wealth, which is brand new in Arabia because you're nomadic. You can't accumulate stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And now you have this massive accumulation of wealth. What ends up happening over the period of a century or so before Muhammad is that you have this profound inequality. You have members who are incredibly wealthy, and that wealth comes from their connection to the Kaaba. And then you have this massive group of people who are wallowing in poverty, unprotected, widows, orphans, the poor, the slaves, the people who are in debt. Muhammad's revolutionary message that there is no point in the Kaaba, therefore there is no point in Mecca, therefore there is no point for the Quraysh. And all of this thing that they have built is all just a lie. It's all crumbling, was profoundly appealing, interestingly enough, not to the poor and to the weak and to the unprotected, the people that Muhammad was, servicing with this message, but to the kind of young, up and coming, what we would refer to nowadays as sort of the middle class. So his first followers are not poor and dispossessed. They're actually fairly well off members of this religio-economic system who are disgusted by it and their role in it, and see in this community a way of returning to an original vision of what the tribe was supposed to be. So it's really fascinating, right? I mean, so these
Yeah, it
early
is.
followers, it wasn't the religion, it wasn't the
Uh,
spirituality, it was the very real social impact, right? The social justice movement that turned them on. And again, I would just remind people that, a 20-year-old, is as radical in the 1960s as he is in the 600s, right?
yeah,
That this
yeah,
is
yeah,
this
yeah,
is the time when you're
yeah, yeah.
like, yes,
Yeah.
let's change the world, you know? That was his original followers.
I would also imagine, Dr. Aslan, that some of the heads of smaller, weaker tribes would also be incentivized by this. Okay, if all of a sudden Kaaba doesn't have the centrality of all these gods, of being the repository of all these gods, then maybe there can be some sort of equality amongst tribes, and Quraysh won't be so powerful.
Including Muhammad's own tribe, where he came from a very small but influential
Yeah,
clan. That's right.
that is fascinating.
And so when he is forced out of Mecca and he goes, like a couple of 100 kilometers away to this uh, series of villages known as Yathrib, which will eventually become known as Medina, that's actually what really starts to drive people to this new community. You have to understand that in pre-Islamic Arabia, there was only one form of identity, and that was your tribal identity. You didn't exist outside of your tribe. A person without a tribe had no rights. You could
Wow.
kill that person and there'd be no retribution because they're not protected. They don't have a tribe. They're not a person. Muhammad, when he leaves Mecca and really begins to experiment with this new kind of community that he is building, is doing something absolutely unheard of. He is building a brand new tribe. But whereas in the past, the only way to join a tribe is to be born into it, there are these client relationships that you could have. But really, the only way that you could actually be a member of a tribe is to be born into it. But Muhammad's tribe is something new. You don't have to be born into it. You can just choose to join it. You can just leave your previous tribe and
Wow.
come and
Wow.
join this brand new tribe, which is not ethnically connected. It's not connected by blood. It's not connected by birthright. It's connected by one thing, a set of beliefs. And that's it. And
That's
Muhammad
revolutionary.
becomes the sheikh of that. It's revolutionary doesn't begin to even imagine. Like this, it was never imagined before. There was no way of even considering yourself as a person in this kind of structure before Muhammad came up with this. And he came up with it out of necessity.
Yeah.
But it didn't exist. It didn't exist.
Yeah.
That's why he calls it something different. He doesn't call it Islam. In fact, there's every reason to believe that no one called themselves a Muslim until after Muhammad's death, that the whole thing wasn't even called Islam until after Muhammad's death.
Dr.
He calls it
Aslan, go ahead.
he calls it the ummah, the community. That's what he calls it.
Was that concept new based on what you're saying? It's
Absolutely new.
yeah. Yeah.
It's a super tribe. It's a new way of
Super tribe.
thinking about what a tribe is. But all you have to do is believe, and you're a member of this tribe now.
I just want to highlight here, and I'm preaching to the choir here. I just want to highlight here that in the last few minutes, you were really talking about social and political issues more than theology,
Listen,
right?
here's what everybody needs to know about religion. And every scholar of religion will tell you this. We have this absolutely false conception that prophets invent religions. That actually is what it means to be a prophet.
Yeah.
That Abraham invented Judaism, or that Jesus invented Christianity, or that Muhammad invented Islam, or that the Buddha invented Buddhism, or that Zarathustra invented Zoroastrianism. That is not true. Prophets don't invent religions. Prophets just reform the religions in which they were born. The Buddha was not a Buddhist. The Buddha was a Hindu. He was reforming Hinduism. His
That's
followers turned that
fascinating.
reform into something called Buddhism. Jesus didn't invent Christianity. Jesus was a Jew. He was preaching Judaism to other Jews. He was reforming Judaism. His followers turned that into a new religion called Christianity. Muhammad, by his own admission, repeatedly in the Quran, was not inventing a new religion. He's not creating Islam. He's just reforming the Judeo-Christian, let's call it Hanifism, that he arose out of. It was his followers who then turned it into Islam. This is true for every prophet.
That's
Prophets are not
yeah.
inventors of religion. They are reformers of their own religion. It's their followers who are then tasked with the impossible mission of trying to make some sense out of what this guy just said post his death.
Yeah.
And their followers are the ones who turn it into a religion.
An institution and then polities and sometimes even empires.
Mm-hmm.
I'll close off our conversation, Dr. Aslan, with this question. It's something that I hadn't planned, but as you kept on talking about the society of Saudi Arabia, different systems of beliefs, and Muhammad's own upbringing in this milieu, if you will, um, I want to know this from you, please. Is it hard to conduct research about Islam? I imagine that you can't just get up, land in Saudi Arabia now, and just go to the Ministry of Culture, whatever it's called. Hey, can I have your records from the year 621, 610? I imagine there are restrictions on that, or I don't think you can just get up and go to university in the city of Isfahan in Iran or wherever, or even Egypt or Jordan and bust out and start talking about Islam.
Well, look, I will say that Saudi control over the Hijaz has made archaeological research more difficult. And we scholars, we historians, desperately rely on the hard work that archaeologists do in finding material evidence buried, under centuries of, rock and sand and dirt and mud,
Yeah.
in order to then make certain conclusions about them. That said, Saudi Arabia is quite new. The Islamic Republic is quite new. In both of those regions, there have been centuries of deep, sophisticated archaeological work. And, we have a lot of documents, a lot of documentation. But yes, look, you're talking about ancient history. And
Yeah.
almost everything that I just said to you is very well researched, but fundamentally very well educated guesses, right?
Interesting.
Where did the
Interesting.
Kaaba come from? Probably Zamzam, but
Yeah.
can I prove that? Not unless you let me dig. Not unless you let me
Yeah.
dig. If you let
Yeah.
me
Yeah.
dig up that entire area, I could probably prove it, but that's never going to happen.
That's never going to happen.
So I have to rely on, the bits and pieces of information, the material evidence collected here and there, the text. The one thing that people will say a lot about Islam, as opposed to Judaism or even Christianity, frankly, is that it arose in what is sometimes referred to as the full light of history.
Hmm.
So we do have a lot of information about the early years of Islam and the Prophet Muhammad. And what we can do is use that early information and compare it to what we know about that region, uh, and what we know about how religion functions to make these very well-educated guesses about how a particular idea arose, or where Muhammad would have gotten a particular viewpoint or a particular idea that one finds in the Quran, etc.
Yeah.
Um, that's what makes it fun. It's
It
why we all
does.
disagree with each other too, by the way.
Dr. Aslan, thank you so much for educating me and our audience. And to our audience, if you know of any history that could unravel the Middle East, please share it with us. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. This was fun.
This was a lot of fun. Thank you.